Everyone, and welcome to the Toronto's Tower Cathedrals of Commerce tour. My name is Mike Benetti, and I'll be leading this live stream tour today. Just to give you a little bit of some background, there is a link just below the video that you should see on your screen to a document that has some numbered pages on there with additional photos and information on some of the buildings that I will be talking about today. And I'll just give you a couple seconds to download that. For the comment section, please leave any comments, and I will try to answer them live here if the video streaming allows me to. It's being a little finicky. If not, I will answer them later today, so feel free to check back later for any answers to your questions. Just to give you a little bit of information about myself, I am an urban planner, and I specialize in public transit planning. But I do have a big interest in the city's history and architecture, so I led this tour last year in person and hope you enjoy the live tour version of it this year. So to start off, we are going to do a tour of Toronto skyscrapers. However, the skyscraper is a relatively recent invention, and there's two reasons why the skyscraper really wasn't prominent before the late 1800s. And one of them is people only really had stamina to climb about 5 flights of stairs. And so without an elevator, the skyscraper was an impossible invention. And the second reason skyscrapers didn't happen until the late 1800s is if you had load-bearing walls, such as brick walls, you couldn't build very high because the brick walls would have to be very thick at the bottom of the building to support higher stories. So that also limited buildings. And you roughly saw them about 5 to 6 stories at the most because of those two reasons. However, in the late 1800s, there was 2 inventions that allowed the skyscraper to become a building that could happen. One was the safety elevator, invented by Elijah Otis, and you'll see that on page 1 of the attached document. And until the safety elevator, people didn't want to try this newfangled contraption because they were worried that if the cable broke, you would plummet to your death. And so the Otis safety elevator took that concern away with a special emergency braking system that if the cable was severed for any reason, the elevator would not plummet to the ground. And Otis showed this at fairs and to different demonstrations around the United States by riding in this elevator and having someone cut the cable down. And then the second invention that allowed the skyscraper to really happen after the vertical movement issue was the steel frame construction, which you can see on page 2. And the steel frame was invented in Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire, and Chicago is the birthplace of the skyscraper. And so the world's first skyscraper is the Home Insurance Building in Chicago. It unfortunately was demolished, but it allowed the architects of the day to show how a steel frame construction could work and allow for higher buildings. And the steel frame allows you to have a lightweight building constructed very easily, and then you just use stone as a facade or glass. Your facade of choice just hangs off that steel frame. And it was also very popular because it was fireproof after the Chicago fire. So those 2 inventions allowed skyscrapers to actually be invented and used, and they're an American invention. And so Toronto actually is one of the cities, even at the turn of the 20th century, was one of the main skyscraper cities in North America. But there was some tension to this because Toronto was a city of the British Empire. And so it was more of this British city surrounded by the great American cities of the time of the Great Lakes. So you had Buffalo, Cleveland, Rochester, Detroit. And it's hard to believe now, but these cities were the preeminent cities of the world at the time, and lots of new inventions coming. And so there was this tension in Toronto whether the city architecturally was going to go the American way or try to forge its own identity with a more British Empire, imperialistic type of architecture. And so I'll just read one quote from an architecture magazine at the time. And it said, "When Great Britain is incapable of setting an example of architectural achievement to her dependencies, other nations more virile will slowly but surely take advantage of her relapse and bring about an imperial disaffection. In Canada today, there are but 2 evident tendencies of an appropriation of American ideals and methods of expression not entirely to be attributed to the natural influence of cosmopolitanism and a post-imperialistic ideas." And so that gives you an idea of the tension that was going on here at the time, and the skyscraper was not welcomed because it was seen as an American invasion of Canadian architecture. However, that didn't stop skyscrapers from being built. And so we're going to look at the first cluster that happened in the center of Toronto's financial district at King and Yonge Streets. And so before that, if you look at pages 3 through 5, you can see some of the more first higher buildings that were coming on board in Toronto in the late 1800s. And they're not true skyscrapers, but they were reaching a little bit higher than normal. But they still were topped out at only a few floors because they weren't able to use the steel frame. The only exception to that is the Temple building, which you can see there, that did have a steel frame construction. So going past those first buildings, we're going to look at the first true cluster of skyscrapers in Toronto at King and Yonge. So the first one is the Traders Bank building, which you can see here. And it was completed in 1906. And at the time, believe it or not, with only 15 stories, it was the tallest building in the British Empire. It was designed by Carrier and Hastings out of New York City. It has 2 million bricks and 1,700 tons of steel beams. And it was also the first building in Toronto that was said to introduce the New York style of leasing system where you leased office space by the square foot. And it was the headquarters of the Traders Bank, which was eventually overtaken by the Royal Bank of Canada in 1911. So this is technically the oldest skyscraper in Toronto. Now, at the time, all different companies wanted to have the highest building in the city. So, a couple years later, the Canadian Pacific Railway decided they wanted the highest building in the British Empire. And so right next door to the Traders Bank, they opened in 1913 the Canadian Pacific building. At 15 stories, it was the tallest building in the British Empire, and that's because it has some little cornices at the top, little towers that stick above, so it goes a little bit higher than the Traders Bank building. And so this building is more an Edwardian style of skyscraper, and it housed the companies of the CP Railway, had a telegraph floor, and a grand 2-floor marble lobby and ticketing office. That lobby, unfortunately, was removed and is now the Shoppers Drug Mart that you see on the first 2 floors. This building was originally covered in terracotta. However, it was reclad in Indiana limestone due to the harsh winters. The terracotta was not taking Canadian winters too well. And of course, this building didn't remain the highest building for long because the Royal Bank of Canada decided they wanted the tallest building in the British Empire. And so right across the street from the CP building and fully covered in construction scaffolding at the moment is the Royal Bank building. And that was completed in 1915 with a very grand total of 20 stories. And so this building became the tallest building in the British Empire. And it's interesting to note that the Royal Bank is headquartered in Montreal. However, they decided to build their tallest building in Toronto at the time. Unfortunately, this building had a beautiful banking hall, but it was removed and turned into offices as well. And the upper floors at one time did hold the Toronto Board of Trade. And then there's one bank that didn't want to go with being the highest in the British Empire, and that is the Dominion Bank of Canada. And you can see their building here. And this building was built in 1912, and it only has 12 stories. However, it was the headquarters for the Dominion Bank of Canada, and it's now the One King West Hotel. They added what was at the time the most slender skyscraper in the world right next to it, known as One King West, and it's attached to this beautiful older building. And the top floor boardroom is used for weddings and conventions now. And so this building sort of completed the King and Yonge skyscraper cluster at the time. And if you look at the following pages, you'll see some photos of the Toronto skyline at that time and what it looked like. So those are pages 7 to 10. And we're just going to walk over to some other skyscraper clusters just east of Yonge Street. And as we go by, I'll just show you again, the views of the Traders Bank building and the CP building. And so this cluster here at King and Yonge in 1920 was one of the densest concentration of skyscrapers in the world. And really, except for New York and Chicago, there weren't really many cities that could rival this cluster of what was then considered tall buildings. And the Royal Bank building here is, as I said, going under restoration right now, so that's great to see. But you can see that with all the new skyscrapers around, these original skyscrapers really do get sort of lost in the skyline, and people really don't pay much attention to them or really notice that they're here. So the reason why we're going east of Yonge Street is because the center of Toronto's business district, until relatively recently, was at King and Yonge and east of King and Yonge, more towards what is the Gooderham building and the Flatiron building. That was the center of Toronto commerce. And over the decades, it's slowly moved west a little bit to where it is now at King and Bay. But the reason that it was east of here is because that was the center of the city. You had St. Lawrence Market and all the other activities of the old town were east of Yonge Street. So we'll just be there in 1 minute. And as we're walking down King Street here, you will see one of our other original skyscrapers, the King Edward Hotel. And so the original hotel you see here was completed in 1903. And it was commissioned by the Gooderham Distillery Company, the owners of the Gooderham Distillery, because they wanted to revitalize this part of the central business district. It was starting to get a little run down. Things were starting to move further west towards Bay Street. And so they wanted to cement that this was the center of the business district still. And so they added a tower in 1922 that you see right next to the original building, and that became one of the tallest buildings in the city at the time. It's a gorgeous building inside. If you ever have time to go in the lobby, it's a beautiful lobby. And so the next little mini skyscraper cluster we're coming up to is actually Toronto Street. And Toronto Street used to be lined by beautiful heritage buildings. You can see the remnants of a few of them here, but unfortunately some of them got demolished for newer high-rises. But the building we're going to focus our attention on is that beautiful white terracotta building you see there with the green cornice, and that's the Excelsior Life building. And this building has the distinction of being the last major building that E.J. Lennox completed. And E.J. Lennox is a famous Toronto architect. He designed Old City Hall, and he also designed Casa Loma. And this was one of his only skyscrapers. Again, it's not very tall, but for that time, it was considered a high-rise. And this building, too, sort of gets lost in the more larger buildings here, and also because it's not really in the center of the business district, a lot of people sort of don't know it exists here. And the owners of the building did a great job of keeping this historic building while also modernizing it. So if you ever have time to go in the lobby when Toronto reopens, they built a beautiful modern atrium in the middle of the building connecting with a newer section. And it's a really great job of showing how we can keep our heritage buildings and still modernize them for today's use. So I'll just stop here for a second, give you a full view of the building. And now we're going to walk to a building at Adelaide and Yonge that for years coming downtown every day I did not think was as old as it is. And you'll see why in a minute. But as we're walking there, you'll see the new addition to the Excelsior Life building right here, and they sort of melded the two, the old and the new, together here with this atrium. And as we come up to Victoria Street here, we also see one of the original towers in this sort of little cluster east of Yonge. And this is the Victoria Tower. It was completed in 1929. There's not much known about this building, and it sort of gets forgotten as well. But you can see it in some of those photos. It stands prominently in the Toronto skyline at the time. And this building also shows an issue that came of light in New York, and that is skyscrapers were being built straight from the street level right up as one solid wall, and it was creating a lot of daylight darkness on the streets of Manhattan and other cities. And so because of this, New York became the first city to institute a zoning bylaw, and that bylaw was that skyscrapers had to step back every so many stories so that daylight could get in. Other cities did follow through, but New York is the most famous for seeing those step backs today on a lot of the old buildings from around 1915 up to the 20s. And now we come up to the building I said a lot of people might think is a lot newer than it is. And this is the Lumsden building. And at about 10 stories, it's still considered a skyscraper of the time. And it actually was built in 1910. And the reason why this building looks different is it actually uses manufactured stone. So this was very unusual at the time. It's basically like pressed concrete. And that was very different from what was normally used, which is bricks or terracotta. And if you look at page 6, you can see what the building used to look like. It had an ornamental cornice at the top, and that unfortunately was removed in the modernization era that a lot of buildings went through in the 50s to 80s. The old ornamentation was not seen as valuable anymore, and so they were removed on a lot of buildings here, and some buildings were re-facaded at the time. This building originally had a swimming pool and a Turkish bath in its basement, and so it was one of the prominent buildings here in the business district at the time. And we'll just give you a look of it as we walk down Yonge Street to the next stop. And as we're walking towards Yonge Street, you can see the cluster of new towers that have sprung up over the last few years here in the business district. So the building with Deloitte is the Bay Adelaide Center. There's 2 towers to that complex. And then further down, you can see the new Ernest & Young Tower, which incorporates an old Art Deco skyscraper into the first about 20 floors. They did a great job, again, of sort of keeping the old building and then adding in a new addition on top of that. And behind the Ernest & Young Tower, you can see another glass skyscraper, and that's the Shangri-La, which is one of the tallest hotels in the city. And we're just coming back to a view of the Lumsden building here. As you can see, Yonge Street, there's some people out, but it's definitely a lot quieter than the city normally is. And not a skyscraper at all, but this building here, the Deneen Coffee Company, this building was in rough shape, and it has been fully restored and is a great example of what we could do to more of the old buildings on Yonge Street. Instead of demolishing them for skyscrapers, as much as we like skyscrapers, they can be restored and really have an interesting uses to them along the Yonge Street corridor. And so our next stop is not a skyscraper at all. It's actually the Hudson's Bay Queen Street store, which also has a section for Saks Fifth Avenue, which you see there. And the reason I'm pointing this building out is that the Hudson's Bay Queen Street store was completed in 1896, and it's one of the first fireproof steel frame buildings in Toronto. And so the steel frame is, needed for skyscraper construction, but this was basically the first fireproof building in the city. And the reason it is because the original department store, built in 1895 for Simpson's department store, actually burned down less than a year after construction. And so Robert Simpson rebuilt the building to be fully fireproof. This building really exemplifies the Chicago School of Architectural influence with the windows you see on the lower levels. And its beautiful terracotta detailing makes it a beautiful retail landmark. And for the shopaholics here, this building is the second largest department store in North America after Macy's in New York. It has about 1 million square feet of shopping, and it really takes you back to the golden age of downtown shopping, when department stores like this were the main attraction when you came downtown. So we're just crossing Queen Street now. We'll be heading over towards the Bay Street Skyscraper Canyon. As we're walking down Queen Street here, you see a streetcar going by. For any people interested in public transportation, Toronto has the largest streetcar system in North America and the second largest streetcar system in the English-speaking world after Melbourne, Australia. And we were going to lose our streetcars just like every other North American city at the time in the post-war era, and the TTC was decommissioning them. However, a citizens' revolt in Toronto actually convinced the TTC to retain the streetcar network on its busiest routes. And so that's why we have the streetcars today. And it was an interesting time because cities were getting rid of them, so there was really not many manufacturers to buy them. So the Ontario government designed the old streetcars that we were used to until these new ones came out, and they were only found in Toronto. As we're walking towards Bay Street, you can see a glass skyscraper here. This is the Simpson Tower, and it was actually built by the Robert Simpson Department Store Company as their headquarters in the 1970s. Of course, Simpson's is no longer. The Hudson's Bay Company bought them in the 1970s, and they kept the name around till about the mid-90s, and then all their stores, including the main one here, was converted to Hudson's Bay. Now as we come up to Bay Street, you can see Old City Hall. This building was opened in 1899. And it's not a skyscraper, but at 340 feet, the clock tower is one of the highest structures, or was one of the highest structures in Toronto at the time. And it was easily taller than a few of the skyscrapers that came after it. And E.J. Lennox was a very interesting character. He had trouble getting payment for this commission from the city of Toronto. And so if you walk around the building, you can see little faces engraved on some of the stonework, and they have very ghoulish looking faces. And that was his way of getting back at Toronto City Council, because those faces are the names of councillors of the day. Looking straight ahead, you can see a building with a spire on it just across Nathan Phillips Square. And that's the Canada Life building. The Canada Life building was completed in 1931, and it stands at 321 feet. Its weather beacon was added in 1951 and is a downtown landmark. And I point this building out because if you go up to it, it has a Beaux Arts design to it. And the plan of the day for Toronto was that University Avenue was going to be lined with Beaux Arts buildings and traffic circles with fountains. It was going to be part of the City Beautiful movement of making the downtown area this beautiful place to stroll around in. However, the Great Depression happened, and the only building to be completed from that plan was the Canada Life building. It's a beautiful building. It actually had an observation deck on the top floor for many years, and during Doors Open Toronto, you can get a glimpse up there and get a view of the city from the top level. It also was the first building in the city to have a living wall in it, where plants purify the air. And as we walk down Bay Street now, you can see the cluster of high-rises that started to sprout up here in the 1920s, because by then Bay Street and the financial district moved west from King and Yonge, and Bay Street was becoming the preeminent business center of the city. And so one of the first skyscrapers you see here is the Sterling Tower, which is the tallest older building you see on the corner here. And that was completed in 1928, has 21 stories, and is 330 feet tall. And for anyone who looked at the pictures of Toronto's first skyscrapers, and there was the Temple building, this is what replaced the Temple building, 390 Bay. So we're just going to walk down Bay Street now to King and Bay, which is now the epicenter of Toronto finance and of our skyscrapers for now. And I say for now because cities evolve, and there's a lot of skyscraper construction happening south of Union Station now. So we'll see how the business district evolves and if south of Union becomes the new core. But as we walk down Bay Street here, you can see some of the older high-rises that have survived. And they look very similar to what you would see in American cities of the time. And as we come up to Temperance Street, you can see one of the old high-rises on the left-hand side here that was incorporated into the Bay Adelaide Centre. And just across Temperance Street, you can see tower number 3 for the Bay Adelaide Centre. Toronto went through almost 20 years of no to little skyscraper construction downtown. At the time, this was the 90s into the 2000s, and at the time, businesses were moving out to the suburbs for cheaper taxes and rents, and so there was a glut of office space downtown. And it came on the heels of a recession in 1991, and from previous skyscrapers that were built right before that recession. Thankfully, things have returned to the downtown area, and now businesses that moved out to the suburbs are coming back, and that's why you see a lot of these skyscrapers under construction again in the past couple years, because there's a movement back to the downtown for business. People don't like working in the suburbs anymore. At the corner of Adelaide and Bay here, you can see the Canada Permanent Building. It was completed in 1930, and it's a great example of Art Deco design, which was very famous for skyscrapers in the 1920s and 30s. Again, if you ever have a chance to go in the lobby, beautiful 1920s lobby in there. And again, this building has a newer addition that actually bridges the gap between the Canada Permanent Building and the Bank of Montreal building. And so again, they were able to put in a modern structure in between and keep the two heritage buildings. And now we're coming up to King and Bay in a minute. And before we do, I just want to draw your attention to the east side of Bay Street here with the Bank of Montreal, First Canadian Place Tower. And if you look at page 11 on the attached document, you'll see the old Toronto Star building, which stood here at the corner of King and Bay. And unfortunately, it was demolished in the 1970s to put up the First Canadian Place complex you see here. If you want to see remnants of this beautiful Art Deco building, take a little trip out to Scarborough to Guildwood Park. And there's actually remnants of the building in the sculpture or in the architectural gardens there. And there's pieces of Toronto buildings from all over the city there that were demolished in our boom of the 60s and 70s. And you can go there and see what we lost. So here we are now at King and Bay, the epicenter of Canadian finance and of skyscraper construction in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so the first building we're going to look at is the Bank of Commerce building, now known as Commerce Court North. And this building was completed in 1931. It has 34 stories and is 476 feet. And at that height, it was the tallest building in the British Empire until 1962, when Place Ville Marie opened in Montreal. It has Art Deco influences in it, but also Beaux Arts. It had an observation deck at the top where you see the little faces overlooking the city there. It's unfortunately no longer open. Taller buildings opened up, but also the railing is very low, and so they can't get modern insurance companies to insure people going up there. But it did have an observation deck, and if you have time to ever go in the lobby, it's beautiful. And so it is now part of the Commerce Court complex. The Bank of Commerce became the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, CIBC, and so they merged the different banks together and created this complex. So we're just going to cross King Street now. And we're going to take a look at the Bank of Nova Scotia building that you see here. And this building is interesting because it looks like an Art Deco building that should have been built in the 1920s or 30s. However, it wasn't. This building actually opened in 1951. And it was one of the more prominent buildings on the skyline at the time. And the reason it opened in 1951, but looks like it was built in the 20s, is because the Bank of Nova Scotia did want to build their headquarters building here in the 20s. However, the Great Depression happened and that plan was put on hold, and it wasn't until the late 40s that they decided to start construction on this building. If you look at pages 12 to 13, you can see the Toronto skyline in the 30s to the 50s, and you'll see the prominence of the Bank of Commerce Tower, seen here. You'll see the Bank of Nova Scotia building, and you'll also see the Royal York Hotel, which was one of the most prominent buildings at the time. That's the last stop on this tour because it's not in the cluster with everything else. And so that's how the skyline looked for quite a few decades in Toronto. There wasn't a lot of new high-rise construction. However, in 1969, Toronto opened its first modern skyscraper, the Toronto Dominion Centre that you see here. The tallest tower is the Toronto Dominion Bank Tower, and it was completed in 1967, and then other buildings opened up into 1969. It has 56 stories, and at 731 feet, it was the tallest building in the British Empire. This building also had an observation deck when it opened, and it is now the Canoe Restaurant on the 54th floor. This building was designed in part by Mies van der Rohe, which was the preeminent architect of modernism. He wanted to get rid of all the frills you saw in the older high-rises. He wanted very simple construction and design. He didn't like those frills. And he is basically the best architect if you love steel box skyscrapers. His designs are the best. And so this complex here is actually his largest work that he ever designed, and so Toronto's very lucky to have that. And at the corner here you can see the banking pavilion, and he didn't leave any detail unturned, even though these are simple buildings. And so if you ever go into the bank branch here at King and Bay, you'll see yellow flowers at the bank teller locations. And that was a stipulation from his design, that the bank had to always have yellow flowers as part of the design in the banking hall. This complex is beautiful, and it should be protected as a heritage building. However, it does replace a beautiful old Bank of Toronto building that was standing at this corner. And again, it was demolished for this complex, and if you want to see pieces of it, you can go to Guildwood Park and see pieces of the old Bank of Toronto building there as well. And so on pages 14 to 15, you can see the TD Centre under construction. You can see the old Bank of Toronto building that was knocked down, and also see just how prominent this building was on the skyline at the time. This was the 1960s. Toronto was really starting to come into its own as a major metropolitan city. It was starting to overtake Montreal a little bit as the business center of Canada. And so these buildings really marked a departure from the old, boring British Victorian Toronto into, you know, the modern metropolis that started to take form there as we had a population boom and new immigrants changing the dynamics of the city. So King and Bay was basically the epicenter of the height war between Canada's major banks. And so the TD Centre was the first bank, or Toronto Dominion Bank was the first bank to build a new modern skyscraper and the tallest building in the British Empire. And so the other banks didn't want to be outdone by that. And so in 1972, CIBC opened Commerce Court West that you see here on the other corner of King and Bay. And they built it just a little bit higher than the TD Bank Tower. It has 57 stories and is 784 feet tall. This building also had an observation deck. And to try to draw people into the observation deck, since there was one across the street at the TD Centre, they actually had an aviary at the top of the building in the observation deck, so you can see birds and the view of the city. It's no longer operational, as you can guess, and is now just office space. This building was also designed by a very famous world architect, I.M. Pei, out of New York City. And it was said to be the tallest or the largest building in the world clad in stainless steel at the time. And so if you look at page 16, you can see what the city skyline looked in the early 1970s with this height race for tallest building in the city, with the TD Bank and Commerce Court West sort of dominating the skyline there. And now we move to the bank that really went all out and still holds the title for the tallest bank building in Toronto. And that's the Bank of Montreal. So they built First Canadian Place, which opened in 1975. At 978 feet and 72 stories, this became the tallest building in what is now known as the British Commonwealth. And it also held the title of the tallest bank building in the world, and also had the highest sign in the world from 1975 until 1997, when the signs on the City Plaza in China overtook the Bank of Montreal sign that you see at the top of this tower as the highest sign in the world. And I'm going to mention the signs just again because Toronto is sort of unique in that regard. A lot of our tallest buildings have signs on them. You have Bank of Montreal, Bank of Nova Scotia, CIBC, and TD that you see here. And it really is different from other cities at the time that really don't put a lot of signs on their tallest buildings. The First Canadian Place Tower is also famous because it was one of the first buildings to start using double-decker elevators, because a problem as you get taller is that the elevator banks start to take up more leasable space that you could be making money on by leasing office space. And so the double-decker elevators allow a smaller number of elevators by having the upper elevator serve, say, the odd floors, and another elevator is directly attached to that main elevator below it, and it serves the even floors. And so if you go into the lobby of the Bank of Montreal, or the First Canadian Place Tower here, and also Scotia Plaza across the street, you have to go in the basement level or concourse level to board an elevator for certain floors, and the main lobby level if you're boarding, say, for the odd number floors. When this building opened, it was the 6th tallest building in the world, and it was the tallest building outside of New York and Chicago when it was built. And Toronto really was prominent with having some of the world's tallest buildings at the time. And this remained until the 1990s, when Asia started a building boom in skyscraper construction. And now, or in the 90s, it used to be New York, Chicago, Toronto, and a few other American cities had the tallest buildings in the world. And it's no longer that. North American cities are much lower on the list now for any of the tallest buildings in the world. And it comes at a time when business in North America didn't want to be showy anymore. They were all about cost cutting. And so they're not building these grand palaces to commerce anymore. And it's sort of a shame, but it does show you how we've fallen on the tallest building index, because our companies here just don't have the pizzazz anymore to want to go grand. And some people view that as a good thing. Some view that as not so great, because we should be striving and wanting to build amazing structures in our cities. So the last bank to sort of come to the height war here at King and Bay is the Bank of Nova Scotia. And they completed Scotia Plaza in 1988. And you can see it's the red tower behind the old Bank of Nova Scotia building. And at 902 feet and 68 stories, this became the second tallest building in Toronto. It was designed by Webb Zephyr McKeans here out of Toronto. And they're famous for other buildings such as the CN Tower and the Royal Bank Plaza. And the great thing about the Scotia Plaza is that they actually did incorporate the historic Bank of Nova Scotia building. So instead of like Bank of Montreal demolishing the old skyscraper that was on the premises, they incorporated this older building into the newer building. And so if you go into Scotia Plaza, it has a beautiful atrium that's about 10 or 11 stories high. And the modern portion of it does have Greek motifs that play on the Greek motifs that you see in the older Bank of Nova Scotia building. The tower is clad in red Napoleon granite from Sweden. And it has a sort of chevron shape at the top that allows for 12 corner offices per floor. And instead of using a steel frame construction, they actually used poured concrete. So this was at the time the tallest building and largest building in the world using a poured concrete framing system. And before we leave the King and Bay intersection here, I'm just going to point out one other change to the first Canadian Place Tower. And if you're familiar with Toronto architecture, when looking at this tower now, you would say it looks a lot more shiny and bright. And that's because the building was originally clad in Carrara marble, and the harsh winter conditions here did not do that marble any good, and it was starting to fall off the building. And so a few years ago, Bank of Montreal replaced the facade of this building with a sort of baked glass facade. And so it's easier to clean, and the panels will not fall off from the harsh winter conditions. And this is not a situation that is unique to the first Canadian Place Tower. There's the Ion Center in Chicago, which was also designed by the same architect. It was clad in marble, and pieces of it started to fall down, and it had to be reclad as well. So that rounds out the King and Bay cluster of skyscrapers, and we're just going to walk down to the last few buildings down at Bay and Front. And as we're walking down Bay Street, you can see one of the newer skyscraper complexes on the Bay Street corridor, and that is Brookfield Place. It was originally known as BCE Place, and it was opened in 1992. And at 863 feet and 53 stories, the tower you see here with the stepped back top to it is the Canada Trust Tower, and that was the third tallest building in the city when it was opened. This building or complex here was the last complex built before the recession. And as I had said before, there was a glut of office space for almost 2 decades here. And so this was the last major complex, and then you just did not see skyscraper construction for a while here in Toronto. To the left of the TD Canada Trust Tower, you can see the Bay Wellington Tower, and that has 49 stories and is 682 feet. There was originally supposed to be a third tower constructed. However, because of the recession and the glut of office space, that third tower was never built. There's some speculation There's some speculation you may see that tower constructed now. However, this coronavirus outbreak is going to be interesting to see whether we need as much office space, because maybe more people will only come in a couple times a week moving forward. So we're going to have to see how this coronavirus epidemic has changed the office working environment. And as we come up to Bay and Wellington, you can see the Royal Bank Plaza here. It was completed in 1979, and it's a departure from the other banks because the Royal Bank did not go for highest building in Toronto. Instead, they competed with the other banks in a different way. They clad the building in gold windows. And so all the windows you see here have about $70 worth of gold in them if using 1979 dollars. In today's dollars, that would be about $235 a pane. And so that was Royal Bank's way of sort of winning the race on having the best bank building in downtown Toronto. You can see there's two towers here. The tallest one is 590 feet and 41 stories, and there's a shorter tower that's about 30 stories. And in between is this atrium you see here. Originally, the atrium was open to the path level, and it had, or it still does, have a beautiful sculpture with 8,000 white and yellow enamel steel rods that hang from it. Unfortunately, to create more office space, the Royal Bank in the 1990s covered up the open atrium from the concourse level to create a trading floor space. And so now you have to go up to the higher level floors to see the sculpture. However, if you can ever sneak your way up there, it's a beautiful modern sculpture. And so Royal Bank really was the last major bank to open a new skyscraper on the Bay Street corridor. And there was some infighting apparently, because apparently the gold windows are such great insulation from hot weather that the gold was shining the sunlight into the TD Bank Tower, and apparently the TD Bank Tower's air conditioning rates skyrocketed. And so I don't know if this is urban myth, but there was apparently a lawsuit from the TD Bank against Royal Bank to be compensated for the increased air conditioning costs that these gold windows created. And if you have any ideas of trying to steal the gold out of these windows, you can't. They're baked in a special way, so if you break the glass and try to extract the gold, you apparently can't extract it. And as we move down to Front Street, you can see the beautiful Alan Lampert Galleria of the Brookfield Place, and it connects the TD Canada Trust Tower and the Bay Wellington Tower. If you've never been inside it, it's a beautiful interior space. It's designed by Santiago Calatrava. He's famous for these types of designs. And the design here is supposed to be palm trees blowing in the wind on either side, and they're flowing into each other. And so Brookfield Place really is the last great, I'm going to say the last great skyscraper complex that was built in Toronto. The newer ones that we're starting to see just don't have the same pizzazz. They're not often taking star architects anymore. It's more just about, building cheaply and not really focusing too much on the design anymore. And as we come up to Front Street here, you can see some of the newer towers that are starting to rise. So the tower under construction there is going to be the new headquarters for CIBC Bank. They'll still have offices in the Commerce Court complex, but they are building this new complex. And so this is going to be a test to see if the banks start moving their headquarters south of Union Station here. Royal Bank has also opened a new tower south of the CIBC building, and so we are starting to see some movement of business down there. And we'll see what happens as development continues. And so here we are at our last stop in a moment when we cross the street here. And we're at Bay in front. You can see Union Station here. And across from it, the Royal York Hotel. And the Royal York Hotel is the only heritage skyscraper that we didn't see previously because it's not built near all the other skyscraper clusters, and there's a reason for that. So the Royal York Hotel was opened in 1929, And at 29 stories, it was the tallest building in the British Empire. And with over 1,000 rooms, it was the largest hotel in the British Empire, actually until the 1990s. And so the reason the Royal York is sort of separated from the rest of the skyscraper culture is because Canada has a unique architectural style, and that is the railway hotel. And there's actually books about our railway hotels, but most of them have this chateau-style architectural design to them. And they were built by the Canadian Pacific Railway mostly, and a few other railways. And they were always built relatively close to the central train station. And so you go in any major Canadian city, there's some really famous ones like the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, the Hotel Vancouver in Vancouver, the Banff Springs Hotel in Banff, and the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. And so, as the railway hotel of the city, it had to be built close to the train station. And an interesting tidbit about the Royal York Hotel is that many people think the original hotel was the entire building you see here. However, the original building opened in 1929 was just the left portion of the building you see here, the portion that sort of makes the H. And as Toronto kept growing and there was need for additional hotel space, in the 1950s, Canadian Pacific Hotels built this addition to the right. And they did a great job because they followed the same style as the 1929 building instead of trying to do something modern. And so if you're just walking by and you didn't know that, you would think the entire building was built at the same time. The Royal York Hotel, when it was completed, was a virtual city within a city. It has the largest kitchen in Canada. It still does. It also had other things like its own hospital and operating room in case any guests got sick while they were here. It was the preeminent social place in Toronto. Even up until the 1970s, people would come downtown for concerts at the Royal York Hotel and dances. And it's sort of not so much a place that locals come to anymore in that much of a fashion, but it's still a beautiful hotel. And in the, unfortunately, modern era of the 50s, they did cover up the lobby with wood paneling. And if you go in the lobby now, it has been fully restored to its 1929 style. It has beautiful inlaid wood ceilings. And they actually just opened a bar last year in the center of the lobby, so you can actually enjoy it by sitting down and having a drink. It's a great example of the of the Canadian Railway hotels history in Toronto and in Canada in general. And so if you ever get a chance, make sure to check out the lobby. And crowning the Royal York Hotel was originally a rooftop garden that you can see just below. You can see the railings of it from just below the Royal York sign. And so in its day, you could go up there and also see views of Toronto. And so we're going to end this tour with pages 20 to 23. And those give you a glimpse of what Toronto's skyscraper future was looking like in the 1960s and 70s and in the 30s. And so we're going to start with page 20, which is Vimy Circle. It was that plan for University Avenue. And so you can see what one of the circles was supposed to look like with the beautiful Beaux Arts buildings on each side. On page 21, you can see the Eaton's College Street store. And the original base, the Eaton's College Street store, is still there. It's known as College Park. However, Eaton's department store in the 1920s did want to build the world's largest office complex and the tallest building in the British Empire on top of the department store. Unfortunately, because of the Depression and also a buried creek underneath the building, that skyscraper was never completed. And as you'll see, the Eaton's family really wanted to build a tall building, because on page 22, you can see the original plan for the Eaton Center, and it looks nothing like what we got. And that's because if you look closely, you'll see the only remaining piece of Old City Hall is the clock tower. And that ultimately killed the first plan for the Toronto Eaton Center, because Toronto's residents got really upset that Old City Hall was going to be demolished for a 60-story building. And so the Eaton family went back to the drawing board and designed, or had the Eaton Centre that you see now designed. On page 23, you can see the Metro Centre development plan for the railway lands, which is basically all the lands from the Union Station up to the CN Tower. And it had a number of skyscrapers planned, including a very different style of CN Tower. That plan was also nixed because it hinged on the demolition of Union Station to be replaced with a modern, newer building. And so, as you can see, rightfully so, residents did not want this beautiful building being demolished. And so that killed the plan for the Metro Centre. And the Metro Centre was supposed to have offices, condominiums, event space. It was supposed to be basically a city within a city. And thankfully, back then Toronto was its citizens were very engaged, and so they were able to stop the destruction of beautiful buildings like Union Station. And it's sort of a reminder for today, because right now we're losing a lot of heritage buildings to skyscrapers and high-rise condominiums. And there's not that same interest by our residents or city planners to save our heritage buildings anymore. And we were known throughout North America for being able to conserve our heritage buildings while still allowing the city to grow. And we've sort of forgotten that. And we need to get back to remembering to save some of our heritage buildings as well, while still allowing the city to grow. And here you can see just the front street view of the Royal Bank Plaza. Looking at page 24, you can see the John Marin Tower, and that was a 1970s proposal by the Eaton's department store family to build on top of Eaton's College Park. By this time, the Eaton Centre was going to be opening in a few years, and so the Eaton's College Street branch was not going to be needed anymore because it was being the department store was being consolidated into the Eaton Centre site at Dundas Street. And so they really did want to build this building on the site, and it was going to be the world's tallest at 140 stories. Again, that never came to fruition, and instead a 30-story McLean Hunter Tower was built above the Eaton's College Street store. And page 25 shows you the original plan for the Bay Adelaide Centre in the 1990s. And it's a much more interesting design than the one you see now. And that building, unfortunately, the original design was a casualty of the recession and the glut of office space downtown. And it was supposed to be the tallest building in Canada with the spire on the top of it. However, they only built about 10 stories of the elevator shaft before the recession and the glut of office space killed the project. And so for about 15 years, if you walked in the vicinity of Bay and Adelaide Streets, you would see this shell of an elevator shaft. That shaft was used for the first tower of the new Bay Adelaide Centre. However, as I said, the new towers are really just glass boxes and nothing as unique as the original plan for that development. So with that, we have come to the end of our tour of Toronto skyscrapers. I'd like to thank you for coming on this virtual tour. I hope you learned some interesting tidbits about our skyscraper history. And I will close with one interesting stat, and that is that Toronto is currently building the most high-rise buildings out of any city in North America. In fact, the number of high-rises under construction in Toronto is the total number of basically New York, Chicago, and other American cities combined. And so we're building a ton of high-rises right now. A lot of them aren't very interesting, but we are a high-rise city in many regards. And a unique thing about Toronto is our high-rises go out into the suburbs. So if you go to Chicago, for example, most of the skyscrapers and high-rise buildings are downtown. But Toronto, if you look at it from the CN Tower, there's high-rises everywhere. And that sets us apart from almost any other North American city. And it's a very unique urban landscape. It's sort of a mix of European and American suburbia in one. So with that, thank you again for coming on the tour. I will check out your comments and answer any questions you had. And enjoy the rest of this beautiful sunny day in Toronto. Thank you.